A very, very warm welcome to those that are joining live. Hello. And those that are capturing this in the future, people of the future, hello. Welcome to the recording. My name is Richard Freeman. I'm the Chief Executive of a consultancy called Always Possible. We were really thrilled to collaborate with the University of Sussex, the IA project, and a number of academics within the social sciences on putting together this toolkit, which we've called an academic's guide to real-world engagement. It's not as patronizing as maybe that sounds. It's very much a practical, a kind of 101 guide to unlocking the value in your expertise and research. We think there's some really missed opportunities, perhaps, or some untapped potential for academics to apply their expertise and skills in the commercial world, in the public sector, in the voluntary sector. And sometimes it just comes down to not necessarily having a shared language. So as a consultancy, we work across all of those different sectors. We have clients in big business, small business, the charity sector, social enterprise, big local authorities, health, etc. And often we're hearing that people really, really want or feel there's a lacking of some research or evidence or insight around a particular model or idea in order for them to determine sort of what next steps to take. And then equally, when we work in the university sector, we're often told that business or big institutions are a bit closed, hard to find your way in. Sometimes it's quite difficult to know where to start. So this toolkit, we hope, addresses kind of both of those sides of that equation, really, and is very much aimed to help people wherever their starting point is to break down some of those barriers. So I think a couple of kind of key principles ostensibly about this session and about the toolkit itself. So what I'm sharing here is the PDF version. So rather than reframe it as a PowerPoint presentation, I don't think there's any point doing that, because this is the document that is available and you're going to be using. So it seemed better to walk through the actual document that you can start using immediately rather than turning it into something else. So what you see is what you get. But that also means there's a lot of text and there's a lot of detail that I'm not going to run through verbatim here. So I'm just going to go through the sort of highlights and the headlines and more around the different sections of the toolkit and some of the tips and things in there. The toolkit is absolutely not designed to be read from cover to cover in chronological order by every researcher and academic thinking of commercializing or applying their work in new contexts. We've deliberately tried to break it up into different sections. And if we start with the contents page here, which I'll just run through in a second, the idea very much being that you dip in and out of the bits that are relevant to you. So find the bits that are useful. I'm sure there'll be many people listening in and here live for whom a lot of this is absolutely already second nature. So my mission is not to tell you what you already know. So what I'm doing is walking through the toolkit so that if there are bits in there that might be helpful at different points, you know where to go and where to start and how to use them. That's the idea. But I want this session, a couple of people here joining live. Let's have a dialogue. You ask me questions as we go. If bits seem unclear, just pipe up and say, can you say that again? Or what do you mean by that? Or have you got an example? That's absolutely fine. Happy for this to be a conversation rather than a lecture. It's a document that's available for people to use. So if you're catching this later on, do make sure that you go to the site. We'll make sure that the kind of link's available, but you'll have it in the email anyway, on the University of Sussex, the kind of sub-page where this is housed. So you can download it and start looking at it as you're hearing me talk about it, etc. It's immediately available to use. Okay, so just before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty, I'm going to walk through something that we're calling the moments of truth. And that's a sort of a model of engagement that we use a lot with anyone, clients or individuals that are trying to be heard or be seen or get their ideas in front of new audiences or people perhaps they've not worked with yet. And it takes some quite traditional, maybe some old-fashioned ideas of marketing and flips them a little bit and helps to think about the people that you want to get in front of, how and when they might be making decisions about what they're buying or what they're bringing into to their world. So I'm going to start with that, just as a bit of a kind of background context, and then ask you to have that in the back of your mind as I then walk through the other sections, because those different points of decision making might be then helpful in terms of how you contextualize for in your own context some of the other bits that I'm talking through. So I'll start with that in a minute, but then the sections I'm gonna run through in terms of this toolkit. So section 1 is all about how different, I mean, we'll use the word clients here, and we do use that advisedly. Some people may think of who they're working with as collaborators. Some it might be partners, whatever. The idea is that it's people who are bringing your services in and your expertise, your knowledge, because they want to tap into that. So section 1 is thinking about how different sorts of organizations in the private, public and voluntary sector approach decision making, particularly when commissioning research, consultancy or training that you might be offering. Section 2, we're going to think about how to share your expertise. So that's thinking actually about the vehicles you might use if you're going to be charging for that work, how to do that, and some of the sort of basics of setting up a business, thinking about sort of the rhythms of different kind of organizations, when and how and what to sell, and thinking about marketing and communication. Now I know a lot of researchers find the idea of selling a bit uncomfortable, and that's absolutely fine. So really this is about creating value in the work and the expertise that you have. So there's lots and lots of ways to apply your expertise for money or for not. And I think this is really about how you just how a new audience can commission you in, but a big part of that I think is around commercial thinking, and that's what certainly the feedback we got is people wanted to know how to manage some of that. So we will run through that. And then section 3, really important, is about the value of networks and how to use networks to be visible, how to use networks to share ideas and to you kind of find potential people to work with. Section consultancy and training and some of the ways that that has been offered. And we've got a couple of spotlights as well that we'll draw upon. And section 5 is your unique selling point. What is it about you as a researcher, as a consultant, as somebody, an academic out there in the commercial world that makes you stand out? Why would people want to come back to you or refer you on to other people? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but they are the main sections in this toolkit. So hopefully that resonates a little bit and you think, well, at least one of those will be useful. And I'm going to run through the document in chronological order. Any questions at this point from Luke or Saskia or Ali? Anything that feels already sort of baffling? Okay. Do feel free to put questions in the chat bar or ask me anything as we go. So the first thing is kind of how and why to use this toolkit. As I've said already, this is not a book. It's not a cover-to-cover brochure. We're not expecting people to have it as bedside reading. It should be something that you just kind of come back to as and when you're sort of building your journey outside of academia, and thinking of how to apply research in different contexts. This, we hope, will just be a thing to come back to with some tips, some ideas, some reference points. And why it has been commissioned is because I think there is an understanding that universities are not always sometimes there's sometimes consistent in supporting academics to take their work outside. The context in which this sits is that there are obviously a huge number of programs, whether it be knowledge exchange or innovation programs. There's lots of, or have been lots of ERDF funded programs where academics work with the commercial sector. Obviously, universities are huge parts of and sit within their community, and so have an awful lot to offer businesses. That's always been the case and always will be the case. So there'll be many programs I'm sure that you are familiar with and been a part of and feel have been really successful. What we understand is, though, that within the social sciences, some individual researchers just find the application of that as a kind of expert going out into the field just a little bit harder than some other departments. There's much more of kind of training and a clear narrative, perhaps in tech or in some sort of more formula sciences, where people are brought in to go and do a particular piece of research or investigation. Whereas in the social sciences, it's sometimes a little bit harder to navigate, and certainly, I think, to be fair, harder sometimes for businesses to know whom they might be able to draw from in terms of expertise and skills. So that's why we're looking at that kind of commercial thinking and those partnerships within that this particular sort of academic context. And the big thing is around confidence. That's what we've been told is sometimes the big barrier. It's knowing the language, it's knowing where to start, and having some idea of approach. And that's what we really want to help people understand a little bit here. Okay, so the moments of truth that I talked about. So I think this kind of underpins a lot of your potential thinking, and I think it's a helpful way when you're planning to get out there in the world. Maybe you've been invited into something, or you want to approach it cold. I think this is quite helpful to think about the kind of problems you're solving for your audience, or thinking about what they might be driven by in terms of decision making. So we look at it in 4 stages in terms of sort of from no awareness of you whatsoever through to being your biggest fan and champion, and recommending you to lots of other people. Obviously, that's the ideal goal. That's where you want to get to. So looking at these 4 stages between those 2 points. So the first stage is interest. So this is the first time that someone becomes aware of you. Someone says, "Oh, you should speak to Dr. So-and-so. They've got a, they are the person to talk to about this. They'd be really helpful for your product or whatever, your launch or whatever you're trying to do." So that's the interest point. So, at that point, you're trying to think, okay, what do they need to know? What is it that's going to interest them in what I've got to offer? And usually at that point, it's about keeping things really concise, compelling, clear, simple. They're not going to read a full thesis. They're not going to want every published work. What they need to know is the very basics, perhaps, of your areas of expertise and maybe some of the things that you've done before. The next stage in terms of moments of truth and decision making is action. You want those people then to take some action. What should they do in terms of contacting you or having a coffee or maybe reading a bit deeper or further something that you've produced? So you need to think about how it's really easy for them to do that. Is there a website? Is there something on LinkedIn? Do you have something you can send them? Is there something they can sign up to? Have you got a Substack or a newsletter, something like that? But you want them to be able to take some action, so it moves beyond just that initial, who are you? And then it's the experience. This is the really key bit. When they're working with you, when something moves forward, when there's a piece of work, maybe a pilot or a trial, making sure that you are kind of helping to engineer a little bit the experience that they have, making sure that it's a good one, so that they will keep coming back. And then the 4th stage is advocacy. You want all of these people that you've worked with to be your biggest fans, recommending you to others. In the world that we work in, 99% of new business or further business is going to come from recommendation and advocacy. People trust people and people buy from people. You could have an advert on the side of every billboard in the city you work in saying researcher for hire. That isn't going to do anything like having people who are trusted say, you should work with so-and-so. They're really, really good. So it's not rocket science, but these are the four stages of getting people to engage with and escalate the kind of working with you. So have that in the back of your mind when I run through the rest of the toolkit. And this is a model we use lots of people. So there's loads of examples here, scenarios, questions, how you might use these different stages, the kind of tools that you might use at different points, from sharing articles to running workshops, how to use networking, etc. I'm not going to run through all of that in detail now, but it's quite helpful to plot the rest of the toolkit and the things you might want to use on the different stages of this, considering sort of where you're at on your journey with a particular partner or client. So section 1 is about how different organizations approach decision making. So I'm sure that many of you, you obviously know the difference between public and third sector and private sector, but there are some key nuances in terms of understanding how they make decisions. When we talk about public and third sector, we're obviously talking about government, charities, social enterprises that are community interest companies, the education sector, local government, NGOs, specialist networks, think tanks, quangos. These are very, very big procurers of research, consultancy, and training, because most of these organizations have some stake in the policy world. They are providing services that they're continually looking to evaluate or to innovate around, and they're trying to make sure that their services are relevant for the people that are using their services. So when you're thinking about decision, who's making decisions in those organizations, there might be different levels or different types of people, say, than if you were trying to win work or work with a big corporate or a fast-growing tech SME or something like that. There's going to be different points of decision making and different people that are going to be making those decisions about what to work with. So I'm going to come to that in a second. Obviously, when we talk about the private sector, even that is a large and vast sort of spectrum. So you've got your huge multinational corporates at one end. Again, they are a big procurer of research. They want to make sure that when they're going out in the world with a new product or service, whether that's a kind of social value end or very, very commercial, they are going to want to stress test that. They're going to want to make sure that they're pitching it right, they've got it for the right audience, they've considered every angle. So whether commercial or social value end, there are always lots of opportunities for academics to provide skills. But the private sector also includes tiny organizations and what we call SMEs, so small to medium enterprises that could have 1 member of staff or could have 100 members of staff. So it's also, a lot of it's about doing your research. And we use something called, what we've referred to here, RACI, R-A-C-I. You can flip those letters around and call it RC, but that's just a bit ruder. So we go with RACI. And it's quite a helpful little thing to think about in terms of who you might want to first make an approach to or engage with, looking at where they sit in the kind of hierarchy of decision making. So R stands for responsible. So this is going to be the person responsible for delivering a particular project or service. So it might be a manager or a senior operational figure. So often they are going to be very key to unlocking particular value or insights, making sure that the thing that they are developing is going to hit all the right notes, that maybe something they've launched or released, they might want some evaluation or some review of that to check that what impact it's having. They might want to know about how to apply particular new research within academic communities. How could they apply that in a commercial setting? So that person who is responsible, so they may not be the most senior person in the organization, but they will have a level of managerial responsibility. So it's finding those people, whether it's private, public, or voluntary sector, that's going to be quite key. Probably above them is what we call the A, is the person who's ultimately accountable. So that's going to be somebody probably more senior, who's going to be the overarching figure that's going to be responsible for that project's success. Now, they'll have an interest in who's providing the research, consultancy or training, but they probably aren't going to be all over the detail. So it's worth, when you're kind of planning how you might want to approach some organizations, to let them know what you're offering, that it's important to know who that person is, but it might not be the gatekeeper that you're looking for. C stands for consulted. So it's people with any kind of project who are likely to be consulted about that work. So that might be other members of staff working on it. It might be other parts of the organization, or it might be other, what we call kind of stakeholders working in and around a particular investigative project or something like that. So it's important to be really aware of who they are, and a knowledge of those will probably be very key, because they might be the kind of people that you're then engaging with, depending on whether you're doing training or consultancy. They're often really important figures within research, but aren't necessarily those that are going to be commissioning it. And then I stands for informed. So it's the people on the edges of the project. So that's likely to be funders, or kind of networks, people who have an interest in the outcome of whatever this is, but are maybe not involved in it directly. Again, useful to know who they are, but they're not going to be the one that kind of brings you in. So thinking about that, it's very much the sort of R in that list. But a little exercise quite helpful is to try and map that out. So, obviously everybody listening is going to have very different research interests, but think of a project perhaps that you've been working on recently, or a project that you've seen out there in the non-academic world that you'd love to have been involved in. Do a little bit of Googling, see who the R, the A, the C, and the I of that project are, and that helps to whittle down who it might be that you want to begin a conversation with. So there's a bit of information here that goes into more detail about levels of responsibility, who tends to be the decision makers and at what level, who constitutes those R, A, C, and I figures. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail, but what we've got here, which is worth having a look at, is a little kind of what we call a kind of matrix of decision makers. So across the top there, we've broken it down into two sizes of private sector, three sizes of private sector, sorry, and then third sector and charities, and public sector and local government. So through that matrix, you can start to kind of move across who are the decision makers, how might they make their decisions, so what sort of process might they be going through in terms of commissioning research and consultancy and training, and a couple of small tips on where you might start in terms of demonstrating your value to that particular person, what might be a really interesting starting point. So again, I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail, but I think that's a very important place for you guys to start when using the toolkit. So what I will have a look at here is a kind of summary of some useful steps in terms of building relationships with organizations that you think would benefit from working with you. So a few tips here. Start with building the relationship. You've got to work out who are those figures, the R, the A, the C, and the I. What kind of organization is this? What kind of size is it? What kind of budgets are they working on? What kind of impact does their work have? And so by building a kind of network of contacts, you'll better start to understand what those challenges are and areas of possible growth. Because really, your expertise is going to be coming in before they've done something quite often. It's usually at a testing point, or maybe a review point. Maybe they've tested something, but it's not quite out there in the public yet. So it's quite a challenge, quite difficult for you to know exactly what they're up to, because usually it's sort of behind the scenes and it's not something they've shared yet, and that's what they'll want the help researching. But the more that you can start to build up a bit of a picture of that organization and some of the key people in it, the easier that's going to become. And I really can't overestimate the importance of that relationship building from the start. So again, it's about connecting regularly. You can, networks like LinkedIn and stuff are really, really valuable for that. It's not just a business tool. It's a way of kind of researching and engaging with all sorts of different people that may be on that RACI list. If you've got to the point where, you can start to see a problem, or you can start to see a place where your work can have real value, but maybe they don't know that yet. start creating a kind of brief in your head. Think about how to define or recognize their challenge or problem. And that might feel presumptuous, but actually it's a really helpful way of defining how you might apply some of your expertise or help. Most organizations don't quite know what they need yet. They just know they need some help. So the more that you can start to hone or define how you might be able to solve their problem, the easier it's going to be when you open up a conversation. But also have that flexibility that you may have got it wrong, or you might not know, but it's still there's often quite a few clues out there, and it's a good starting point just to have a bit of a guess. And that really helps then if those organizations have a consultation period. Certainly if they're public sector, they'll procure a lot of their work if it's over a value of 25,000. So they're starting to articulate their problem. They'll put that out in the public domain. So you can then start to think, oh, how do I align with this? There'll be lots of information put out there. So the more that you can read and engage with before you pick up the phone, the better. Again, looking at the kind of world around these organizations, perhaps where you've identified one you want to work with, assessing the market. Again, preparing for procurement. This is more often with public and third sector than with private. And I'll talk a little bit more about procurement in a minute. But really looking at sort of where do you fit? Who else is in your field? How might you talk about your work in terms of, kind of bullet points? Again, it's that early stage within the moments of truth. They don't know about you yet. So thinking about how to truncate examples or work that you're doing in a really succinct fashion, and then start to map that across. Is the language you're using the language they're using? If they're putting out clues about what kind of help they want, seeing how you can align that. And the question is, if it doesn't feel aligned, maybe that isn't the right organization. So who is? Procurement. So all public money certainly needs to be transparent in the way that it's spent. So procurement is a way for any public or third sector organization that's publicly funded to be able to pull in services and goods, but with a really clear line of sight around how that's happening, so that there's not kind of fear or favor. We've heard a lot, all the accusations thrown at government around cronyism and so on. It's really important that doesn't tarnish a lot of organizations. So they will put a lot of information out in the public domain and gathering quotes from anybody that might feel qualified to help. So that can feel really daunting because that's very strict about how the kind of format that you need to respond to procurement. But I think not enough researchers realise that, or academics realise that, there's a ton of work out there, and there are a ton of opportunities. And so by doing a little bit of digging around and maybe teaming up with some other people, then actually you'd be really well placed to respond to some of those tendering opportunities. Couple of little bits just on working with any sector really, but a lot of people feel I have the lack of confidence to negotiate contracts or pricing and things like that. Negotiation's a sign of a good thing. If people want to negotiate, or they're willing for you to negotiate, maybe you want to rewrite the brief a little bit, or they've put something out there saying we want some help with this, and you're thinking, well, I think actually if they reframe that slightly, this could be more interesting or more useful. Never be worried about putting that out there. Go and talk to them. It's quite often that they'll agree with you and start to see you're the expert on this. So actually negotiating around that and having the confidence to do that tends to put people in a better position. Whereas the instinct says, oh, if I rock the boat or I don't do exactly what it says, then they're not going to touch me with a barge pole. So that's something we really encourage people to develop as a skill. We'll come to sort of contracting a little bit in a minute. Any questions on mainly kind of public sector procurement or anything about that at the moment? Okay. Oh, there's some stuff in the chat there. Okay, so that's all about accessing the presentation, no worries. So in the private sector, the likelihood is that bringing in goods and services, help that they need on something, is going to be a little bit less transparent or a little bit more behind closed doors, because it's their money. They don't have to be quite so open about it or objective in terms of procurement. So that's really where building those relationships is even more important. Doing your homework and identifying some organizations that you want to work with. What are their values? What's their mission? What are they putting out in the world? And sometimes it can just be a coffee that will bring you into a project. Sometimes they can put you absolutely through the ringer, and it can be even harder than the hardest procurement process, because they know how high value a commission might be, and simply because they can. So one good starting point is to look at how an organization is funded in the private sector. So organizations in the private sector will grow, ideally from organic sales. They've got a product or service they're putting out in the world that's valuable, and so lots of people are buying it. But often in the earlier stages, which is when they're going to need their research, training, consultancy most, because they are validating, they are trying to work out whether their thing, what impact it might have, what evidence of need underlines it. Lots of early stage organizations, I think, are crying out for support from academics to really help validate that. Might not be that visible yet. They might not have they might not be a very well-known brand. So it's worth looking at how they're being funded, or how that organization is growing in the early stages. So terms like bootstrapping means, they're just cobbling together whatever they can. Sometimes the leaders are not taking much of a salary, they're using their savings, so they're just building it piece by piece. Now that's, a lot of businesses are built in that way, but they might be quite reluctant to spend any money on anything that's not absolutely core to that commercial growth. That doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities there. There absolutely are, but it's about understanding where they're, what might be their motivations behind that. They might not have a big kind of pool of resources. So that can help with your initial conversations. Certainly if you understand that can be really useful. Other forms of investment, whether it's angel investment or venture capitalists, what we call VC, crowdfunding, or government grants, quite often that might mean quite a large injection of cash into a business because it's made its case, saying we've got a really, really good idea. We now want to turn that idea into something scalable, or really commercial, or the social impact of this is going to be so huge that it's worth investing in for the greater good. Now, those organizations often find themselves from having very few resources to having lots of resources all of a sudden, and they've then got a window to kind of prove themselves. Now, research, training, consultancy, capacity building, being able to stress test their idea is a really, really important part of that process. So I would say, really worth keeping an eye on some of those organizations that are about to go in for funding or have just got funding. And often that's quite publicly known, because, that's a real sign of success. So a lot of stories get into the press and so on. If you look at innovation centers or incubators, where there are lots of startup businesses, they'll often shout about those that have just received some seed funding or some investment rounds. I would say they're very, very good organizations, probably ripe for a conversation about where your expertise might be able to help them justify that investment. A couple of quick tips on understanding decision making, just to summarize this section. So research who your decision makers are, and look at who they're working with and who you want to work with and why. If you're not quite getting the right person, maybe that RACI list is not that clear, then go and find out, ask around. Who's responsible for this project? People tend to share that sort of stuff. Cool. If you're going for procurement, and so going for an open or public tender, go and ask. Those organizations also have a real a mandate to make that process as clear and as accessible as possible. So there'll be lots and lots of guidance released. It can be quite a lot to wade through, but it's worth, it may feel overwhelming, but it's really worth, I think, more and more academics looking at that route, because I know lots of tenders that are not that are not fulfilled. They don't get enough or the right people applying because people just haven't heard about it. So there's loads of sites, which I'll talk about in a second, that you can sign up to that will highlight some of these, but there's lots and lots of research opportunities there. But go and ask, and know that the playing field should be quite level on that one. Ask other researchers what their experience was, who they're working with, what they've done before. There's a network of people who have made this work, maybe in other academic disciplines. They will be a wealth of knowledge around this. And if this is a commercial thing for you, you want to get paid for your work, just understand what the budget is maybe before you start, because you could end up doing a lot of work to try and build a relationship with someone, or to look down a different avenue to find out that there's no resource at all, and they've got an assumption perhaps that you're on a nice big permanent salary from a university and they can just tap into that. So don't be afraid to be kind of clear about that, and just to understand what kind of ballpark you're playing with from the start. So they're kind of tips around finding the right decision makers, whom are going to buy from you, but also who you might want to work with. There's a really good podcast. Lovely thing about this resource is some of the things embedded within it. So Debbie Keeling from the University of Sussex, who helped commission this work, has got a really good podcast episode here, looking at all about researchers as entrepreneurs, think about engagement, new stakeholders, co-creation, the benefits of working with non-academic partners, and so on. So some really good advice and tips in there. Just click on the button here in the PDF and it should take you straight to that podcast. Okay, any questions on section 1? I'm sorry, it's all a little bit whistle stop. Obviously, you'll get to take away the toolkit and there'll be much more in depth there. I've not got much time, but any questions on that section so far? Okay, happy for me to move on to section 2. So this is about you gearing up to share your expertise. So you've identified who you might want to approach and talk to. You've thought about what kind of non-academic partners you might want to work with, whether it's in the private sector, voluntary or public sector. So, it's now thinking about, okay, what vehicle might you provide this service? Are you registered as a self-employed researcher or trainer or consultant? That's the most obvious route to go down for people kind of working solo. Very, very easy to do. It takes about 10 minutes to register self-employed if you haven't already, and that means you can immediately start earning from that work. You need to be able to have the ability to raise invoices and some kind of bank account, ideally separate from your personal one, that you can bring money into. Self-employed people don't pay tax as they go. They pay it once a year through self-assessment. So there's quite a lot there to consider, just to make sure that that's something you're kind of disciplined enough to do. But that's the easiest way to be able to sell your services. But there are other models that we'll look at in a second. But I think it's also thinking about what's the sort of main thing that you're going to be offering. And we think there's kind of 4 ways in which academics are most successfully kind of selling their services. Now, training, that's a broad brushstroke. That doesn't mean just running 1 hour nuts and bolts. Here's a beginner's guide to whatever in a classroom. I mean, that might be part of it. It might be, there might be businesses really wanting to tap into some of your work if you've been a lecturer or so on, and replicating that. We've certainly seen that. But actually training, think quite creatively about what training can mean. That can be tiny groups. It can be working with executive teams or boards of trustees. It could be working with huge numbers of people within a kind of conference cycle. It could be creating resources. So creating e-learning resources, working online. Think about where your expertise is, but don't limit what training might look like based on, perhaps kind of prior conceptions of training you've received. There's a whole world out there of how people are receiving and learning information. So the key thing, training is anything where you are imparting knowledge and checking the learning of the recipient so that they can then go and apply it themselves. Research, again, very broad, but this is about where you would work with an organization to help them create an evidence base so that they can then make decisions about what to do next. All forms of different research could be backwards looking, like a summative evaluation, could be forward looking, doing some market research or going out to consult with potential people. It could be desk based, it could be out in the field, it could be, you know, really high level sort of academic equivalent work, going and doing clinical trials, or it could be something just capturing a few insights and opinions. There's a whole spectrum that research can come into. And again, it's about thinking about what you're comfortable doing and what you're good at, and looking at some of the businesses or the charities that clearly have gaps in their knowledge and how they might best want to fill that. Now, consulting is different from research and training. Consulting is giving advice and guidance, and it's going in and working usually with senior teams on strategy and planning and problem solving. So it's using your expertise to try and help change behavior or decision-making processes within an organization. Again, you know, really useful way for a lot of academics to apply their skills and knowledge, but you know, it takes a certain way of thinking, I think, and thinking about how you want to work with an organization. It can usually be quite high stakes, that, because they're going to be hanging on your word in terms of decisions they're making. So it's important to be really confident about the impact that might have. We've got some information in here about different insurances and things as well, to make sure that you are protected just in case anything goes wrong, to ensure that you know, that you've got the right level of insurance. And licensing is where is your intellectual property. So maybe you've got some resources, some ideas around a particular theoretical model. You've got something that you've trademarked or patented, and actually this is about enabling many businesses perhaps, or organizations, to use that but pay for the right to use it. We're not covering that hugely in this toolkit, because we're mainly looking at services, but it is definitely an area where more and more academics are moving into, and there's lots of resources out there that will help you do that. But I think really importantly, think about which of these four are going to be the kind of core parts of your offer. A few tips here on setting up as a consultant, as a sole trader, or as a limited company. You know, talk to your university. There's lots of advice available, and in general, the institution will be having, you know, funding for research projects in which it wants academics to go and kind of be principal investigators or take charge and move forward with those things. Even some of that you might need to be self-employed for, or you know, providing a service to the university. But there's lots of advice, so go and have a talk about some of those projects that you can maybe get stuck into, certainly to test some things. Think about what kind of payment terms you need in order to be able to live. If you're self-employed and sending invoices, it may take 2 or 3 weeks to get set up on that client's system, and then it may take another month for them to pay. Most people are on 30-day terms, some big organizations on 60-day terms. So can you work without receiving any payment for a few months? That might be quite a challenge. So have a think about whether people would do something up front, or whether, you know, it's once you've delivered a workshop, you want payment the next day. All of those, you know, those terms are up for negotiation really between you and the client. You know, so have a think about what it is that you need and what parameters you're able to work within. Insurance is really important. Make sure you get the right insurance, and that will also help you decide around your kind of business structure. So as a sole trader, you are liable for everything that you do, but if you set up a limited company, there is a distance between you and the company itself. So people are suing the company, not you, if something goes horribly wrong. Of course, I hope it doesn't. But those things are important considerations. There's some advice in here around business structure, but again, there's lots and lots of resources out there around whether you want to be a limited company or a community interest company, a charity, etc. If you're still working with the university as well as a teacher or a researcher there, just check that there aren't any restrictions on you having multiple hats. And chat with your business engagement office because there could be some very specific advice on intellectual property, on some seed funding, on how to commercialize some aspects of your research. So, that would be a really good starting point, perhaps, before just kind of venturing out on your own. We advise people not to overcomplicate things or rush into lots of complex business structures. That can sometimes feel quite tempting when you're setting out a kind of commercial career. Test the water first. Be self-employed for as long as you can, and talk to lots of other people. There are lots of people who get burnt by creating really unwieldy structures that they then kind of topple over. So that would be a little bit of advice. Go slow with that. It can often making big decisions about that can wait a little bit, but do get a business bank account and try and separate out your finances. Get as regular with administration and the flow of administration as you can. Checking in, getting invoices out, maybe get some help around that, or there's loads and loads of really good software that will help, things like Xero or QuickBooks. Even if you're not that mathematical or a kind of big finance head, they're very, very easy to use and are built for sole traders. So lots more information in there in the toolkit about sole trader, about kind of the tax that you'd need to pay. Lots in here about private company and the different types of private company and how to register on Companies House with links. And there's some information here on partnerships as well. So you may see something like an LLP used for a firm of solicitors, or sometimes maybe a dental practice. So that's where you have some individual professionals who want to create a kind of practice together, whether it's virtual or in a physical premises. They don't want to jointly own a company, but they also want to benefit from sharing expertise and maybe back office resources, accountancies, that sort of stuff. So they form what's called a limited liability partnership. And that means that the individuals are separated from that partnership, much like if you had a limited company, but it doesn't have all the rigmarole of a limited company. So can be really, really beneficial if you wanted to join together forces with some other people and look at that, but obviously make sure that you've got the right partners there and understand all of the kind of pros and cons. It doesn't work for everybody and it doesn't work in every sector. Information here about VAT and V80, IR35, which is really, really important. It's a relatively new law that does stop, well, the aim is to stop abuses within the gig economy. So freelance drivers working for taxi firms or something and basically working full time, but not having the same rights as employees, like sick pay and maternity and so on. So IR35 has generally made it a little bit harder to be a freelancer working for the same organization for a long time. So have a look at that if you're worried, or you think that that might be a challenge. But again, when you're building relationships with employers, they'll have information on that, and they're unlikely to put you in a position where that's a difficulty, because it would be for them as well. Lots of information in the toolkit about accounting, some of the software that I mentioned, QuickBooks, Xero, Wave. Lots about research and development tax relief, which is very important for academics that are working on projects that are could be commercial one day, but at the moment it's not sure. You're doing some R&D. Lots in here about insurance and so on. Quickly about sort of pricing. I think that's always a really big challenge with anyone starting out. And what should you charge, or how long is a piece of string? But the rule is not to just charge for your time. It's to charge for the value that you are adding to the organization that is commissioning you. So you may do the maths and think, okay, I need to charge £75 an hour if I'm going to meet my rent obligations and put some food on the table and have a little bit left over, blah, 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 if I work a certain number of hours a week doing this as a freelance researcher. But think about all of the other hidden costs associated with your marketing, with you setting up, with the networking, with going along to doing all the research that you need to do in order to try and find who you want to work with. Somehow that's got to be factored in. And always, clients and customers want a little bit more from you than you've perhaps billed for. So think about what the value is that you're providing to them. If your training workshop means that they've suddenly got a huge number of more highly skilled staff, that means they're able to go and charge X amount more. Well, factor that into what you're charging them. They will make their money back from what they've spent on you. Otherwise, they won't be bringing you in. So make sure that's reflected in your fee. You don't want to be too expensive that you're off-putting people, but you definitely don't want to start too cheap, because people will then question whether you really are serious or not. There's some stuff in here about pricing, but considering things like VAT and whether you're charging by the day or by project, there's bits and pieces in here as well. And contract terms and conditions is really important. Often clients will have a template contract that they'll send to you, but sometimes they'll want you to put something together. So there's lots of resources available on doing that, and we point to some bits and pieces in here. What we call here in section 2 is understanding sort of client business rhythms. So that's thinking about what sector you're working in. When are they, if it's an education, there's going to be points of the year where, there's no point trying to get meetings with education leaders in August. Think about, are you trying to do some research in the tourism sector? Well, they might be completely unavailable in the summer as well. What about, if you're trying to work with law firms or construction, things like that? Think about some of the rhythms of their sector, because, most businesses operate to a financial year, which also may determine when they're planning spend and when they're setting budgets. So as part of your research, when you're thinking about who to approach and to work with, have a think about when they're most likely to be making decisions about money as well. And that comes into those kind of moments of truth. January, February, March is often quite a good time when people are setting budgets. Obviously, this is all about you getting seen and heard, and you being recognized for your expertise. So we've got some tips here in terms of marketing, and you being able to start to talk about what it is that you do, to show the value of the work that you do, and the research expertise that you have, how you put that out into the world. I'm not going to go through all these in a lot of detail because I'm conscious of the time, but there's lots and lots of tips here about how to use things like blogs, podcasts, how to put snippets out of ideas or work. Certainly if you've got books and things published or research papers that could be of real interest to potential clients, don't send them the whole thing. Can you turn a clip of it into something? Can you do a kind of crib sheet or a cheat sheet or something like that about some of the work that you're doing? Break it down and use social media platforms to start sharing that. That's social media is a difficult and often toxic place, but it can also be really helpful for you to get some of your ideas in front of people that you want to work with. Some further tips here on approaching key decision makers, particularly in terms of networking, joining networks, and how to get some of your expertise in a kind of bite-sized format in front of people. So there's lots there, and we break down even more detail on blogging, different social media sites, with some top tips on how to make sure that you're not just throwing that out into the void and that it will get picked up. We've got a couple of spotlights here in the toolkit. One is Dr. Orly Sue, who is a researcher at the University of Newcastle. Thank you, Luke. Thank you for joining. I appreciate that feedback. Dr. Sue is a specialist in gender and women's, she's particularly interested in women in politics. And so she, alongside her academic career, does a lot of consultancy and training for women who are looking at standing for election. So she helps them with their positioning, helps them with research to make the case for why they will have a particular policy position, why they would be a good representative. And And so, she's been able to chart how her academic research has helped people in the real world and how she's a paid for advisor. She worked with Harriet Harman for a long time. But, real challenges in that, how to get that out there. And she's got some good advice on how you create synergy between your academic work and consultancy, because it's sometimes one can absorb the other. So I would look at that case study. And then Louise Harman, who was a master's student at the University of Sussex, is doing some extraordinary work in the commercial sector around death and attitudes towards death. So she's working with charities and with businesses that are looking at bereavement and grief, mental health linked to that. What happens when a staff member suffers a bereavement? How can businesses better prepare themselves and people for that, and so on? So some really interesting research and support that she's giving to the business sector. So have a read of what she says about how she's connected her personal research interests with that as well. Lots of resources here that we've put in another matrix of getting marketing your content, your information, and your expertise in front of those same different audiences that we looked at in section 1. So again, hopefully that feels consistent. And there's another brilliant podcast there with Tom Ormerod and Mina Chiang talking about how to apply academic research in the real world and how to get that story across. I'm very conscious I'm not keeping to time very well, but are there any questions at this stage before I jump into the final sections? Okay. So quickly, but really importantly, the value of networks. Those of you that are here from the University of Sussex will know just how many networks there are in a city like Brighton. A lot of knowledge and information is actually quite decentralized. So there's a huge number of networks within business and different sectors, lots of networks within education, within healthcare. And those networks can be an absolute goldmine for finding opportunities and meeting the right people and being able to share and exchange ideas. But different networks will operate differently. Some will have a very strict member base with a fee or subscription attached, whilst others will be more open. It's worth having a balance of them. Some of those paid for ones will absolutely be worth their weight in gold. Thank you, Saskia. Thank you for that feedback as well. I'm glad you found this useful. So thinking about the networks that you want to join, do a bit of homework, see who's in there. And rather than just how do you join a network and kind of just sit back like a wallflower, what's really helpful is if you can join a network and then offer something. Could you run a talk, a 10-minute talk as part of a session? Would you be able to host something? Would you be able to share something with that network? A way of kind of introducing yourself within that network can be a really good starting point, and it opens up lots of different conversations. So as well as within the social kind of policy arena, there's lots of business networks are really open to researchers and so on joining. Certainly places like the Brighton Chamber of Commerce, for whom I chair a big debate every few months, and we look at all sorts of different topics, from internationalization to what is the workplace and 4-day weeks to the future of skills. And we always have academics on the panel, and create some really good connections between guest speakers and businesses in the room. And I know that there's lots of spin-off conversations from that, and those academics are then brought in to run training as part of Chamber of Commerce sessions. So turning up and showing up and being willing to be part of those things can really, really help open doors and for people to feel connected to your work. We've put here self-promotion. I know people don't like to think of self-promotions, think of it as a little bit vain, but really people aren't going to know you're there until they know you're there. And think about those moments of truth and how you want to get in front of people at certain points of their decision making. So there's a few tips here on how to do that through a kind of marketing lens. And there's a great podcast here from Kate Thorpe at the University of Sussex, talking about networking and the skill of networking and going to networking events. Even if you find that idea horrible, they're probably not as bad as you think. And if you pick the right one, it can be really beneficial. So I need to wrap up, but just very quickly on section 4, this is looking at the difference between consultancy and training, going into a bit more of a deeper dive around how you get across your expertise and raise your profile in these particular areas, thinking about what people are looking for in a consultant, and what they might be commissioning and willing to pay for, what kind of problems they want solving and how you might be able to solve them. So I think some useful stuff there. And again, thinking about training, so it's a broad spectrum, so we can go into a little bit more detail here, as well as other commercialization ideas, such as running spin-out companies using in partnership with the university and so on. But again, a better place to really delve into that will be talking to your knowledge exchange team. So some resources here at the back. There's a video. There's a brilliant toolkit similar to this one from UCRI, which there's a bit of overlap, but also covers some other things that we that are different. So worth having a look at that one as well. And the final section is on your brand and your unique selling point. What makes you you, and what makes you different to any other researcher, trainer, or academic in your discipline. So we've got some exercises here. So there's some techniques on how to figure out perhaps how to talk about your work as something that's a little bit different. You'll have heard of a SWOT analysis, I'm sure. It's certainly what businesses use a lot: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So when you start to have an honest reflection about what your strengths are, what makes you really exciting in the kind of field that you're working in, then start mapping that to maybe opportunities, trends, gaps in your market. You can start to then use that to talk about why your work is different, and also work out what you're not. That's what's useful with weaknesses and threats. It doesn't mean being down on yourself. It means saying, well, actually, that's not an area I'm particularly comfortable working in or good at. So I'm going to define myself as not doing that, and that helps people to choose me because this is my thing, rather than trying to be all things to all people. And that's really important. When you define your value, you're not all things to all people. You're not going to be the right researcher for every organization. Your training is not going to sit with every possible commissioner. So really have a think about what problems you can solve. Think about what your focus is and how you address it. What's your approach? Think about your particular expertise. What findings have you got from your work before that maps across so it makes sense? What will be the benefit of working with you? And get testimonials, get proof of that knowledge. Have you, if you've done conference pieces, you've done talks or TED Talks or anything like that, they would be great examples to use. And we've got some other exercises here that really push you to think, kind of, so what? I can do this, but so what? Pushing you further to really think in depth about what solutions you're offering, what approaches you're offering, and how that could really help to get a client over the line. We've got some tips on pitching and presenting, so how you take that information and then start to put it out there in front of people so that you're not trying to bombard them, but getting the right thing in the right way. And there's another great podcast here talking about intellectual property and how to make a value proposition canvas. So how to kind of map out what your offer is as a kind of business model. Really important and helpful stuff. Loads of other resources and links here to help you think about where and how your work could sit and be part of problem solving. Lots of think tanks here that are increasingly turning to different academics to stress test ideas. And at the back here, we've got a glossary of key terms because there's a lot of jargon that we can't avoid. So we've tried to break that down in terms of defining what that all means. So I'm sorry I've taken slightly longer than I'd planned to, and I'm sorry it was so rushed, but I hope that it's helped you to choose which bits of this are going to be helpful to you and useful to you, and to break down a little bit about what to expect when using it. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you take this away and start to use it, please let us know at alwayspossible.co.uk, or you can find us, or absolutely via your university and the University of Sussex team here who've commissioned us. It would be great to get your feedback. But unless there's any questions now, I'm happy to take another couple for 5 minutes, but I'm aware that a lot of people have had to disappear or will need to go. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining, and I hope that you are able to use this toolkit and go and do some really exciting things in the public, private and voluntary sector. As I said earlier, there's definitely scope and opportunity for more researchers to go and work in partnership with businesses. We love working with academics on our work. It makes it so much richer, and so many of our clients would benefit from it too. So if nothing else, I hope this inspires you to go and be a bit more confident in pitching your ideas. Thank you very much.